Welcome back to today's Explainer. We are diving into what is essentially a 2,000-year-old academic cold case. And this isn't just some trivial debate over a dusty scroll. We're looking at a grammatical mystery that quite literally shaped centuries of religious history. Today, we're zooming way in on a single sentence from the ancient world to see how just one missing word ended up sparking massive debates about the origins, authority, and function of a text revered by billions today.
Here's our roadmap for this investigation. We'll kick things off with an ancient grammatical puzzle, then move into solving the missing verb. From there, we'll explore the voice of God, look at defining the sacred canon, and wrap everything up with equipped for every good work. Let's get to it.
Starting right off with Section 1, an ancient grammatical puzzle.
Our story begins with a single, highly debated sentence written by the Apostle Paul to his younger protege, Timothy. This specific passage from 2 Timothy is actually the New Testament's most direct statement about where the Old Testament comes from and what it's supposed to do. If you look at the classic English translation, it reads, "All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable." Pretty straightforward, right? Well, here is where it gets incredibly fascinating. If you look at the original Greek text, it is completely missing a connecting verb. There is absolutely no is between Scripture and inspired. It's what grammarians call an asyndetic construction, meaning it has no connecting particle at all, and that creates a massive puzzle for translators.
Because of that missing verb, translators are essentially forced into two fiercely competing camps. On the one hand, we have the attributive reading. Every God-breathed scripture is also profitable. Now, this translation describes a very specific subset of writings that happen to already be inspired. But on the other side, we have the predicate reading. All scripture is God-breathed and profitable. This version makes a huge, overarching claim about the divine origin of scripture as a whole, and the entire debate literally hinges on where you mentally plug in that missing word, is. To crack this case, a lot of people naturally look to the Greek word theopneustos, which translates literally to God-breathed or inspired by God. It's a great word, but standard Greek dictionaries, like the famous BDAG lexicon, remind us of a harsh reality. Etymology alone just can't solve our syntax problem here. Simply knowing what the word means doesn't tell us where it sits in the grammatical structure of the sentence. We are going to need more clues.
Which brings us nicely to Section 2, solving the missing verb.
Scholar Daniel Wallace steps up to the plate here, and he brings some really compelling syntactic clues. First, let's look at context. Paul is reminding Timothy of things he already knows, so a very serious, solemn assertion fits the mood perfectly. But Wallace's real smoking gun is a statistical pattern. He points out that when you have the Greek word pos, which means all, followed by a noun, and then two adjectives, the second adjective is regularly a predicate. In fact, Wallace found nearly 50 instances of this exact structural pattern across the New Testament and the Greek Old Testament. All of that points really strongly toward the traditional predicate translation. All Scripture is God-breathed. It's a genuine aha moment in the text.
But as objective investigators, we have to look at the other side of the coin. Modern critic Luke Timothy Johnson completely dissents from this heavy focus on grammar. He actually warns us that this entire debate might be missing Paul's true point. Johnson argues that Paul was focused on the practical, everyday function of the text for Timothy's ministry, not laying out some abstract, dogmatic claim about the origins of the Bible itself. In fact, he cautions against an anachronistic literalism, basically the danger of taking later theological debates and projecting them backward into what was originally just a practical letter to a friend.
Let's move on to Section 3, the voice of God. Stepping back from the intense grammatical weeds for a second, we have to ask, how did Paul actually view these writings in his day-to-day practice? When we read Paul's letters, we see a fascinating habit. Whenever he quotes the Old Testament, he repeatedly uses the Greek word lege, which just means he says. But he habitually does this without ever providing a subject. He doesn't write Moses says or Isaiah says. He just leaves it totally blank. Just he says. So that raises the million-dollar question. When Paul leaves that blank space, who exactly does he think is speaking? The written text itself or God? Well, scholars like B.B. Warfield have analyzed this heavily, and they note that Paul is unreflectively identifying the text authority with the very speech of God. It's totally intertwined for him. In some passages, Paul will literally say Scripture spoke to Pharaoh, even though historically it was God who did. In others, he says, when he's just quoting a written text. For Paul, the line between the written word on the page and God's actual voice is virtually non-existent.
What this means is that Scripture functioned as Paul's epistemological starting premise. It was the foundational rock he used to figure out absolutely everything else. Scholar Gordon Clark points out that Paul didn't try to mathematically prove the text was divine before he used it. He simply started with that assumption. And Richard Hayes highlights how incredibly practical this was on the ground. Think about this. Paul takes a super ancient agricultural law from Deuteronomy, something about not muzzling an ox while it works, and he treats it as a direct, living message aimed squarely at a first-century congregation. To him, it was a living voice speaking directly to his present moment.
And this brilliantly illustrates the ontological view, meaning the true nature of the text, put forward by theologians like John Webster and T.F. Torrance. What actually is this inspired text? Well, they argue it is definitely not some magical, semi-divine artifact that just dropped out of the sky on a golden parachute. No, they call it a sanctified creaturely reality. It is something completely human, totally historically conditioned, and real, but it has been annexed and utilized for a divine purpose. The inspiration doesn't somehow erase the humanity of the text, it leverages it.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4, defining the sacred canon. So all of this raises a very practical, historical question. When Paul specifically mentioned the Holy Scriptures that Timothy had known since he was a kid, what exact books was he talking about? Well, for a first-century Jew like Paul, the traditional Hebrew Bible consisted of 24 books. Now, don't let that number trip you up. In terms of the actual content, it is entirely identical to the 39 books of the modern Protestant Old Testament. The difference is purely in how the scrolls were counted and grouped together, like lumping all 12 minor prophets onto a single scroll.
Tracking the work of historian F.F. Bruce, we can clearly map out how this canon was recognized over time. In the first century, we have internal evidence, like Jesus referencing all the historical martyrs from Abel in Genesis all the way to Zechariah in Chronicles. That strongly suggests a bounded collection with a known beginning and end already existed. Then, over the next 3 centuries, this gets corroborated by church fathers. In AD 170, Milito actually traveled to Palestine to confirm the list. Later on, Origen and Athanasius recorded virtually identical lists of the Hebrew canon. It shows a truly remarkable consistency across hundreds of years.
But, keeping our objective hats on, we also need to note scholar Lee Martin MacDonald's caution here. Did Paul actually view his own letters as scripture while he was writing them? MacDonald reminds us that in the first century, Paul's category of scripture was still somewhat fluid. There's really only one late and highly disputed text, 2 Peter 3:16, that equates Paul's own letters with the other scriptures. The elevation of Paul's letters to a canonical status, right alongside the Hebrew Bible, that was a process that solidified a bit later in history. So when Paul wrote to Timothy, he was almost certainly talking primarily about the Old Testament.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, equipped for every good work.
Let's look at how all this deep grammar and historical mapping translates into actionable boots-on-the-ground ministry. Ultimately, Paul was not writing a dry theological thesis meant to sit on a library shelf. He was handing a step-by-step survival guide to his delegate Timothy. He explicitly outlines the practical functions of Scripture: teaching, reproof, correction, and instruction in righteousness. The entire goal was that the man of God, which was a title for a community leader like Timothy, would be fully equipped to actively lead, correct, and train his people.
And this brings us to exactly why this matters so much centuries later. The English reformers looked at this exact Pauline logic and they absolutely ran with it. Look at Article 6 of the Anglican Church. It confidently declares that Scripture contains all things necessary for salvation. The Elizabethan homilies vividly described it as food for all degrees of men. And the great theologian Richard Hooker built on this exact foundation, arguing that Scripture is completely self-authenticating and sufficient on its own, needing no external magisterium to somehow certify it. They took Paul's practical charge to a single guy named Timothy and built a massive global church structure right on top of it.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Today, we've seen how the debate over just one missing word, a simple, invisible is, rippled through time, influencing everything from nuanced Greek translations to the foundational doctrines of the Reformation itself. So if a single missing verb from the ancient world could end up shaping centuries of global doctrine, what other hidden mysteries are waiting in the texts we take for granted every single day? Keep questioning, keep investigating, and thank you for joining me on this explainer.